Hello, Ted Morrissey here, and I'm making a video for my experimental writing course. I have another video that kind of looks more specifically at the first batch of readings that we did for the course. I'm going to give you a link to that video because again, that speaks more specifically to the stories, the excerpts of stories that we read for this first week of readings. But today I want to do a video which is related to all that, but a little bit different subject matter, and it comes from some of the commentary that was raised on the discussion board regarding Alice Sola Kim's story. 1 hour every 7 years, I think, is the name of the story, which a couple of people raised the issue of they weren't sure why that story was even kind of in the anthology, the Bax 2020 anthology, because they didn't see it as that experimental. It obviously plays with timelines and it's about time travel and that kind of thing. They thought it was a great story, but they just weren't sure what made it experimental. And so I said that one of the things, perhaps the main thing that makes it experimental, is the concept. It's a revisionist piece based on a Ray Bradbury story that's pretty well known. And so what Kim is doing there is taking that well-known Ray Bradbury story and kind of using it as a kind of jumping off point and creating a story of her own based on that story, right? And again, that's a kind of fiction called revisionist fiction, which I think some of you maybe hadn't heard of. I teach a couple classes in revisionist fiction. It's something that's very important to me. I love revisionist fiction as a reader. Several of my stories and novels have been revisionist. But again, it's where you take a well-known piece of literature, a classic piece of literature, and somehow use it for your own creative efforts. Sometimes you update the story, putting it in a different time period. Sometimes you tell the story from a different character's perspective than the main character. I suppose a good example of that is Wicked, which tells the story of the Wizard of Oz, but from the Wicked Witch's perspective, etc. So again, you might take another character's perspective. You might write a prequel to the classic story, kind of give us some backstory to how they came to be where they were in the story that everyone is so familiar with, or a type of sequel to the story. Again, and those are just some options. There's just all kinds of things that you can do. So in that regard, the experiment is to take this original piece that, again, a lot of people are familiar with and to put your own spin on it somehow or another. I make the comparison of it's kind of like a band that does a cover of a classic song, not because they think that the original was somehow flawed and they do a better job or something like that. They just they like the original so much they want to play with it and kind of give their original spin on it. I'm sure you've heard lots and lots of covers of lots and lots of songs. And so, sometimes the cover version is so similar to the original, it's hard to even tell that it is different in some cases. But oftentimes, it's the other extreme where you hear a song and there's something about it hauntingly familiar, and you maybe have to listen to it for a minute or two to realize, oh, well, this is that song. It's just being done so differently at such a different pace or with such a different kind of rhythm or whatever it might be that at first you didn't recognize it. So it can be kind of a varying degrees. And then the same is true of revisionist fiction, that it can be something pretty close to the original, or it can be so far removed that even someone who's familiar with the original may have a hard time seeing how this piece is connected to the classic piece or whatever. But that's just one way that experimental writing can work. And what I really want this video to be about isn't about revisionist fiction, because I talk about that a lot in other videos that you can find online, but about the fact that what experimental constitutes can be many, many things. It can be the way language is used. It can be the way, graphics are used. It can be, the medium by which a story is delivered. And we're going to talk about all those things more as the course goes on. But it could be conceptual. In other words, the writer has a concept for a project which is just sort of out of the mainstream. And so in that way, they are experimenting by trying to do something a little bit different with whatever the sort of expectations might be for a given for a given piece of writing that you normally might find within that sort of genre or whatever. To begin, though, I did just kind of emphasize the revisionist idea. This is a collection of short stories by Joyce Carol Oates. Marriages and Infidelities came out in the 70s, I believe. And in it, she includes several stories that are revisionist that she did back in the 60s and 70s. And she got into this kind of rhythm where she was kind of playing with this approach. And so she took several classic pieces and wrote her own original short stories based on those classic pieces. And just to give you some examples here, these are some stories, and they were all published independently, and then they were gathered back together for this collection. But she did a revision of The Metamorphosis, which of course is Kafka's classic story. She did a story titled Where I Lived and What I Lived For, which was playing with Thoreau and one of his Walden chapters or episodes. The Lady with the Pet Dog kind of riffs on the Chekhov story that's so highly anthologized, and you may have run into it in various guises. The translation of the title changes a little bit depending on the translator. Sometimes it's The Woman with the Toy Dog or something like that, but The Lady with the Pet Dog. The Turn of the Screw, that's obviously playing with Henry James's classic novella, The Turn of the Screw. And then finally, The Dead, which is playing with James Joyce's final story that is in his collection, Dubliners. It's kind of a little novella in itself, and it gets a lot of attention sort of independently in addition to being as part of that collection. So again, the point is that she took some very well-known stories or pieces of writing, sometimes short stories, sometimes novellas, sometimes chapters out of nonfiction books or whatever they might be, and use them as fodder for her own creativity. So it's something that's done a lot. It's done by a lot of writers. If you haven't done it before, I would certainly encourage you to think about it, because it can be a lot of fun working with a piece that you already like and admire and so forth. But that's a concept. It's experimental in its concept. One of the revisionist courses, rather, that I teach is in Shakespeare. And what we do is we read 3 Shakespeare plays, and then we look at 3 contemporary novels that were written specifically to play with those Shakespeare originals. And I hope the course will come together again. I've taught it a few times, but the last time or two I've tried to teach it, the enrollment didn't quite make. So hopefully it will again in the future, because I really love teaching it. And one of the plays that we look at in that course is The Winter's Tale. And I bring it here because this was highly experimental in Shakespeare's day. If you're familiar with The Winter's Tale, you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. But if not, I'll explain right now. In Shakespeare's day, they tended to have plays that were either tragedies or comedies. And what they meant by that is a little bit different than what we tend to mean when we use those words today. But there were these 2 kinds of plays. Well, what Shakespeare did was he took both kinds of plays, tragedy and comedy, and sort of stuck them together in one play. And The Winter's Tale is kind of an acquired taste. A lot of even devoted Shakespeare fans don't care for The Winter's Tale because it's very jarring to go from one medium, the highly tragic to the highly comedic, kind of thing. And so, it isn't, universally loved even among Shakespeare people, but I love it. And one of the reasons I love it is that Shakespeare was definitely going out on a limb and trying something different to see if he could harmonize a play that had these distinctly different features of tragedy and comedy put together. right? So The Winter's Tale. So it's been going on for a long time, right? Um, this is a book. And by the way, for this video, I literally just kind of went to my bookcase and just kind of went around and started pulling books off the bookshelf that I thought I could talk about for a few minutes here. This is a book that I absolutely love, Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban. Russell Hoban is known mainly as a children's book author, but he wrote this really weird post-apocalyptic sci-fi kind of novel called Ridley Walker, and that's the main character. And what Russell Hoban did conceptually, he thought, okay, there's some sort of Holocaust, nuclear Holocaust. Society is rebuilding itself thousands of years later. And one of the things that's starting to come back is written language. And so Ridley Walker is the narrator and the writer of this story, but Russell Hoban had to sort of reinvent the English language because after all those thousands of years without literacy, when literacy is just starting to come back, what would that sound like? What would it look like on the page? And it's not something that you immediately can read very easily because again, has a lot of made up words, made up spellings, and so on. And but once you kind of get into the rhythm of it, it's really quite wonderful. But again, it's an experimental concept. This concept of what would it like if literacy vanished for a few thousand years, reading and writing vanished, but then eventually started to come back. What would that look like? What would it sound like? And that's the story of Ridley Walker. It's really quite wonderful. If you haven't read Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban, highly recommend. All right. So that's a sci-fi story, and obviously, sci-fi writers often kind of push the boundaries with their imagination, and again, there's a whole subgenre of post-apocalyptic fiction, and that certainly fits into that. But again, I think what really pushes the boundaries is that Russell Hoban is sort of reinventing language, the way words work, the way syntax works, the way punctuation works, etc. And so highly imaginative, highly experimental, but definitely worth the effort to read. And then the last book I want to talk about briefly is another book I really, really like, Gertrude Stein and the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Gertrude Stein, you may be familiar with, modernist author, lived in Paris, was a friend to the painters like Picasso, Matisse, etc. Was a sort of mentor to young writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and so on. Highly experimental in her prose. Many of her works are difficult to sort of comprehend what she was up to. But this is probably her most widely read book, and it came a little bit later in life. And she had a lifetime partner, Alice B. Toklas. And what Gertrude Stein decided to do was to write about her own life, but to do it as if her partner, Alice, is writing her life, which pretty much revolves around Gertrude Stein. And if you know anything about Gertrude Stein and her ego, you understand why that makes perfect sense. And so the book actually reads as if Alice B. Toklas wrote it, focusing on her partner, Gertrude Stein, but really it's Gertrude Stein writing about herself through the eyes of this woman who is her lifelong companion and devoted, follower and so forth and so on. And so very experimental. So Gertrude Stein could have sat down to write an autobiography and covered the same events in her life and talked about the same people that she got to know. She talked a lot about the painters and the writers, that she met in Paris. She was very involved in World War II, and so she writes about that experience. And again, she could have done that just as a more straightforward sort of autobiography, but she decides to do it through the lens of her companion, her partner, as opposed to just writing it herself. I know some of you are interested in creative nonfiction, and so I don't know if you've considered writing instead of via your own vantage point, via the vantage point of someone else. I've played with it a little bit myself. And I've really kind of pushed the envelope. I have one short story in particular that begins in pretty traditional, close third person kind of narration. This gentleman is out walking his dog. Well, the gentleman dies, but the story continues through the perceptions of his dog. So the dog is essentially the narrator of the final section of this little story. And I haven't written any other stories like that. It turned out okay. It got published somewhere. I forget exactly where. But point is that you can really play with perspective. You can play with all kinds of things if you get out of sort of the normal human being kind of giving perspective. Like I said, in the case of Gertrude Stein, she found someone else who was part of the same scenario that she was in, but she turned it around and wrote about it through her perspective. Obviously, writing in the guise of animals is pretty commonplace. We think of classic novels like Watership Down, for instance, that kind of thing. My own beloved William H. Gass, my literary idol, he wrote a short story where the main character is a folding chair sitting in a barber shop. And so he tells the story from the perspective of the folding chair. He wrote another short story from the perspective of the piano in the classic Casablanca, Rick's Place bar. So tells the story of Casablanca from the perspective of the piano. Again, very experimental, just sort of playing with it to see what would happen, etc. So anyway, that's what I want to kind of talk about in this video, that sometimes what makes a piece experimental is the concept that the writer is playing with. So maybe the prose itself looks pretty typical, pretty ordinary, although in the case of Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker, it ain't typical, that's for sure. But these other examples that I gave you, kind of the actual prose itself is fairly, conventional. I mean, it's great, it's well written and all that stuff, but it's the concept that makes it experimental. So as we kind of move forward in the course, you're going to see that we're going to be reading more and more kind of avant-garde, innovative, experimental stuff. And certainly you should let that sort of sink in, and that may be very appealing to some of you to try your hand at some of the stuff that's really out there. But keep in mind, too, like I said, that sometimes what's experimental is the concept is original, kind of outside the box, that kind of thing. All right. So I'm going to stop there. I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. Maybe give some examples of your own, of stories, where the concept, the story or the novel or whatever it is, the concept is what is being kind of pushed in terms of the envelope, whereas the storytelling itself is a little more conventional and that kind of thing. All right, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to seeing you down the digital road.